In this video, I'm going to talk about the quadratic equation. So what makes up a quadratic equation? An equation is said to be a quadratic equation if the power or the order of that equation is 2. So let me explain. So if I have x squared plus 3x, then I have minus 10 equals 0. So this is a quadratic equation. If there is no equality sign, so let's say I have x squared plus 3x minus 10. This is quadratic expression. So the difference between expression and equation is the equality sign. So this is quadratic expression, right? While this is quadratic equation. So why do we call this quadratic equation? If the variable, the unknown, has a power of 2, if there's a variable with a power of 2, then it becomes a quadratic equation. If it is raised to the power of 3, we call that cubic equation and so on. So what if I have something like 2 raised to the power of x raised to the power of 2, let's say plus x equals 0. Yeah, this is also a quadratic equation because the unknown, which is the variable, has a power of 2. What if it is something like this? X squared minus 10 equals 0. This is also a quadratic equation. It doesn't matter whether they are up to 3 or up to whatever. So whether it's x raised to the power of 2 or y raised to the power of 2 or something raised to the power of 2, there could be a coefficient or not, but at the end of the day, once you have x raised to the power, once you have x raised to the power of 2 and the coefficient is not 0, it becomes a quadratic equation. So the question now is, how do we solve this kind of equation? So I'm going to talk about the three methods that can be used to solve a quadratic equation. And they are as follows. We have the factorization method. We have the completing the square method. And we have the formula method. So I'm going to go through these various methods that can be used to solve a quadratic equation. So let's start with the factorization method. So let's take the quadratic equation that we had earlier on. So we have x squared, then followed by plus 3x minus 10 equals 0. So the question here is, what's the value of x that will make this equation to be valid? Now let's say we want to use factorization method. How do we go about it? Factorization method is a kind of strategy where you try to factorize the quadratic expression in this format. So it's more or less like you factorizing it like this. You want it to be factorized such that you have something like this equated to 0. Then eventually you will now say let x plus a equals 0 and let x plus b equals 0. So this is what you want to get eventually. You want to get something like this. So that's what you want to get. So how can you factorize this into something like this? Although note that not all quadratic equation can be factorized. So some of them cannot be factorized because you can't get two integers or so that can be, although they can be factorized if those numbers can be any number, any real number. But if you are looking at integers, you may not always get integers like this. So, but let's imagine you are asked to use factorization method and it can be factorized. So let's go through that method. So how do you factorize a quadratic expression? So what you want to do is this. You want to take this, you want to look at it from this perspective. A quadratic equation can be expressed in general as follows. This is the general representation of a quadratic equation. A is the coefficient of x squared, b is the coefficient of x, and c is a constant. Right? Now, if you want to factorize, what you need to do first is you need to take this a. You need to look for what they call, you need to look for two numbers. So this is the factor. The factor is a times c. So let's say ac. Then the sum is B, right? But this time is B, right? Now, what I'm trying to say is this. If you want to factorize, you need to multiply A by C, and that will give you a particular number. Then you also need to take a note. You need to take the note of this B. And once you've gotten these two numbers, then the next question you ask yourself is, what are the two numbers I'll multiply to get this value? And when I add them up, I will get this value. So this is more or less like product. So let me use a more appropriate. So this is product and this is sum. So let me use this example. So in this case, what is A? A here is 1. A here is 1, right? B here is 3. And C is minus 10. So if you multiply A times C, that will give you the product. We give you minus 10. The sum will give you 3. So the question now is, find two numbers that when you multiply those, so let's say those two numbers are m and n. So if I multiply m and n, I want to get minus 10. And if I add m and n, I want to get 3. So that is what we are looking for. Two numbers that when you multiply those two numbers, you get minus 10. And when you add them up, you get plus 3. So how do we go about that? So let's go about it this way. So let's write out the equation again. So this x squared plus 3x minus 10 equals 0. So this is how you find it out. You try to look for the possible numbers. So you look for possible numbers of m and possible numbers of n, and you want to get the product of those numbers, and you want to get the sum, right? Now, what are the two numbers you multiply that will give you minus 10? So let's start with that. So those two numbers are as follows: minus 1 and 10. If you multiply minus 1 and 10, you will get minus 10. But if you add them up, it will give you 9. But what we want to get 3, not 9. It's 3 we want to get. So which means we can't, these two are not the right numbers we are looking for. So you try another number. What are the factors of minus 10? What are the things you will multiply to get minus 10, right? So let's try another value. So you can say maybe 1 and minus 10. If you do this math, of course, you get minus 10. But the sum will give you minus 9, so which is still not 3. Now let's try out another factor. So in this case, 2 and let's say minus 5. And that will give, if you multiply them, that will give you minus 10, which is what we want. But if you add them up, it will give you minus 3. Now let's try this. Minus 2 and plus 5. This will give you minus 10 as the product. But if you add them up, it gives you 3. So now we've got what we are looking for. So the two numbers that when you multiply them, you will get minus 10. And when you add them, you get plus 3. Those two numbers are minus x, minus 2 and plus 5. So what you do here is this. You take this 3x, you write it in terms of these two. So you write in terms of minus 2x. This is plus 5x. You just attach x to this. And that will give you 3x because 6 minus 2 plus 5 will give you 3. Then if you add x, then you just add x to everything, right? Now, you just attach s to everything. So this will replace 3x here. So you just say x squared, then minus 2x, then plus 5x, minus 10 equals 0. So that's it. Now, let's factorize. So you just take this and you take this and you look for what's common. So between these two, what's common? X is common. If you take out x here, x is here, x squared is here. If you divide this by this x, you'll be left with x. If you divide this by this x, you'll be left with 2. Now, the same thing goes here. Plus 5 and minus 10. So you can bring out plus 5 because 5 is common. Then if you divide this plus 5x by 5, that gives you x. If you divide minus 10 by 5, that gives minus 2. equals 0. So now you see there's a pattern. There's minus 2x here and minus 2x here. And that's what we want to achieve. We want to make sure there's something, there's these two brackets are the same. And now that you've got the same brackets, all you just need is just bring out that bracket, right? Then combine what's outside here. So you just take x plus 5. It's more or less like you are factorizing this bracket. You're bringing it out. Then you'll be left with x and you'll be left with plus 5 in another bracket. And this is equal to 0. So now that you've got this form, the next thing is to equate each of these brackets to 0. Because if I multiply two things and it gives me 0, is either A is 0 or B is 0. Because if I multiply two things and I get 0, one of them should be 0. So that's what we want to do here. You want to say, okay, if I multiply these two things and I get 0, it's either the first one is 0. If the first one is 0, you want to find the value of x. So x in this case is plus 2, right? If you take this to this side. But then it's also possible that this other one is 0. So if you assume this is the one that is 0, you're going to get x equals minus 5. So we can now say therefore x is either 2 or minus 5. So in this case, we have two possible answers. So these are the possible values of x. So that's how you solve a quadratic equation using factorization method. We're going to solve another example using factorization method. So let's take a look. So let's say we have this example. We have 2x squared. Then we have something like this. We have 2x squared minus x. Then we have something like this, minus 3 equals 0. So let's take a look at this example. And here we want to look for the value of x, right? So, as I said earlier, what you want to do is you want to look for two numbers, m and n, for instance. And you want the product to be, you want to get the product. But this time around, you want the product to be this times this. So you want the product to be 2 times minus 3, which is minus 6. And you want the sum to be this one here, the coefficient of x, which is minus 1. There's an invisible one here, so which is minus 1. So the question that you ask yourself is to look for two things you will multiply to get minus 6. So just focus on minus 6. Then you start adding up until you get the one that gets you minus 1. So what are the two numbers we are going to multiply to get minus 6? First, look for things you multiply to get 6. Things you multiply to get 6 are 2 times 3, right? And of course, 1 times 6. But then, since you are looking for minus 6, one of them has to be minus. If you are looking for minus 6, one of them has to be minus. Because if one of them is minus, then you get minus 6. Then these two one of them has to be minus, which is minus 6. It could also be something like 2 minus 3. It could also be 1 minus 6, right? And if you do this, you will still get minus 6 minus 6. Now let's add them up. If you add this to minus 2 plus 3, that will give you plus 1. Minus 1 plus 6, that will give you 5. 2 minus 3, that will give you minus 1. Then this will give you minus 5. So which of them is correct? This, because this is the one that gives what we want, which is minus 1. So these are the two numbers we're interested in. So what you do here is you just take this 2x squared, replace the whole of this with what you have here, just attach x to them. So this becomes plus 2. Since this is positive, plus 2x. This is minus 3x. Then you just write minus 3. So we are just replacing this one with the whole of this, right? So this is equal to 0. Now, the next one to do is to factorize. So what's common here? 2x is common. 2 is common here, and x is also common. So that will give you x. If you divide this 2x squared by 2x, you get x. Then plus, if you divide 2x squared, 2x by 2x, you get 1. Now, what's common here? Note the minus. So we can take minus 3. 3 is common, but minus 3 is what you bring out, right? Now, if you bring out minus 3, so minus 3x divided by minus 3, you see minus will cancel out minus, then 3, you'll be left with what? X. Then minus 3 divided by this minus 3 that is outside. If you look at it carefully, you'll be left with 1 plus 1 because this minus will cancel out 1. So that's why you're going to have plus 1, and that's equal to 0. So now these two brackets are the same. So you just take out one of these two brackets. If you factorize it out, then when you take this from these two, you'll be left with 2x minus 3. Just these two will be left equals 0. Now, if these two factors are equal to 0, it's either the first is 0 or the second is 0. So let's assume x plus 1 is equal to 0. If you solve for x, you'll take this to this side. That gives you minus 1. And then if this other one is the one that is equal to 0, then 2x equals 3. Then you have x equals 3 over 2. Therefore, x is either minus 1 or 3 over 2. Okay, so there is one tip I need to give you. Instead of, if you have an objective question and you are asked to solve for x, you can easily get the value of x without going through all these extra steps. So I'm going to give you a shortcut for getting the answer directly without going through all these extra steps. So let's take a look at the shortcut. So this is a shortcut for reaching, this is a shortcut. So let's say this is 2x squared minus x minus 3 equals 0, right? And you've gotten the two numbers. So the two numbers that we're interested in, we've gotten them already, and we said those two numbers are 2 and minus 3. So these are the two numbers that we said if we multiply, we're going to get minus 6, and if you add them, we'll get minus 1. With these two numbers, you can get your answer directly without going through all these factorization steps. So you can simply just say x is equal to, just take these two numbers and multiply by minus 1. Take these two numbers you've gotten, multiply by minus 1, and divide by this value of a. So just divide by the coefficient of x squared. So just divide by this, and the answer is also the same thing. Take this value, multiply by minus 1, divide by the minus 1 I'm talking about is just to negate this. Just negate the value here and divide by the coefficient of x squared. So this will give you minus 1, and this will give you 3 over 2. That's just how you get it directly. So if those two numbers happens to be, for instance, 5 and 7, you just take the 5, negate it, take the 7, negate it, divide it by whatever the coefficient is, and divide it by whatever the coefficient is, and that will give you the answer directly without going through the factorization phase. So let's take a look at another example just to make this clear. So let's say I have a question like this: 5x plus 5x squared plus 11x plus 2 equals 0. So let's say you want to factorize, you want to look for the value of x here. So the first thing you want to tell yourself is what are the two numbers you want to look for. So let's go through that process again. So the two numbers we're interested in are the numbers you multiply, whose product will give you, the product is meant to give you 5 times 2, so which is 10, right? And the sum is meant to give you what? 11 plus 11. So now, what are the two numbers we multiply to get 10? So 2 and 5, 2 times 5 will give you 10, and which will give you 10, and 10 can be obtained by 1 times 10, and that will give you 10, right? But then if you add this together, you get 7. If you add this together, you get 11. So what we are interested in are these two numbers, because if you add them up, you get the 11 we want, and if you multiply them, you get a 10. So now, without going through all those factorization steps, I can simply say that since the two numbers are 1 and 10, I can simply say x is equal to negate this number. So that's minus 1. Divide by the coefficient of x squared. That's 5. Or you negate this number. That's minus 10. And divide by 5. And that will give you this. So the answer is minus 1 over 5 or minus 2. So these are the two possible value of x that will make this equation correct. So you don't need to go through the extra factorization step. This will always give you the answer. So very, very straightforward shortcut for solving quadratic equations using factorization method.